This is Neil.
And this is Laura. Welcome to MedSearch Moments, the AMSN podcast.
This podcast is an engaging look at the lives of and surrounding medical surgical nurses.
We're proud MedSearch nurses just like you, sharing our stories, insights, and experiences to support you in your nursing journey. Our topic today is how to transition from a peer to a leader. But before we get started, it's time for some personal updates. Neil, what's up with you?
Well, as I spoke about last time, I've installed now my third ceiling fan for a family friend. Once I retire from nursing, I can start doing something fun like that. Other than that, just preparing for the holidays coming up. It's a time I like to take a moment just to reflect and really think about what we have to be thankful for, especially over these last few years with healthcare taking such a drastic change, and just glad to be alive and making every day count. Other than that, trying to stay warm. We've had some irregularly cold weather down in North Carolina, so it's been an adjustment.
Yes, we've had some cold snaps here in Texas as well. We've spent the last weekend cuddled up by the fire in our jammies. Other than that, I'm still transitioning into this new job and I'm loving it. Got a lot of people interested in what I do and interested in the new company that I'm working with. So that's been fun to kind of share with. Also took a anniversary trip. My husband and I have been married for 10 years when we went to Atlanta for a long weekend a couple of weeks ago. And that was fun. So now we're just ready to get on with Thanksgiving and start preparing for Christmas.
Well, it's time to get into our topic for today, which, Laura, is a perfect companion to our last episode and conversation where we talked about speaking up and getting management to listen.
I couldn't agree more, Neil. Once you learn to speak up and influence decisions, your next step just might be into one of those management roles. Our topic today is how to transition from a peer to a leader. Neil, you've been there and back. What are the first stories that come to mind for you?
Well, I was very fortunate in some aspect that my first leadership role came as an assistant nurse manager on a card tele floor. Ironically, March of 2020. That time, I had still been part of what we would call our float pool at our hospital. And having worked that particular unit on the night shift, the manager of that unit had recruited me. I'll be honest with you, I've never thought about managing anything. I kind of like being a field soldier, hence I'm back on the bedside. The week before I had taken that job, I'd taken a vacation. So just the week before, I'm there slinging pills and needles and taking care of people, and come back from a little mini retreat. Here we are, middle pandemic. Of course, no one applied for those jobs. The great thing was there was a lot of the float pool that I had just worked with. So when I think about transitioning from a worker to a leader, the great part of it was I had that aspect of having just been with them there last week. And yeah, this has changed a little bit, but this is how I would incorporate this new part of nursing into my daily regimen. And also being a leader, I always think of never being afraid of being back on the bedside. So even with getting some float people, we were still taking assignment a lot of times to help reinforce what we had to do of donning and doffing PPE. I don't like to use the word fear factor, but truly it was, because we really didn't know what we were dealing with at that time. So I think the good thing was, having been there side by side with them just last week, I could say, hey, I know what the workload is like. Maybe make sure we gather all our things before we go in there and do some pre-planning of what might go wrong when you go in there. You might need something, or bring two of everything just in case. So a lot of times aligning yourself with having been there not too long ago is a great way to gain the trust of people that you're going to be in charge of.
It's also really important to keep that in mind as you move forward in your role as a leader, is to try your best never to forget what it's like to be on the front lines. It's easy to get caught up in the new role and looking at nursing and the way the unit runs differently from a manager perspective or even a director. But you've got to keep in mind how busy it is when you're on the floor. Just those little things that come up that you forget about. It's important to stay fresh.
Once again, I think I'm going to try to see how long of a streak I could run and mention Tracy King's name, my former boss, in every episode. She was one that would help out on the floor. And so you get a better working knowledge. And I think any manager, assistant nurse manager, director of nursing, anyone in a leadership role should really never remove their finger from the pulse of what their nurses do.
Absolutely. I can remember my early days as a manager. I was doing my night shifts. I would even come in the middle of the night just to help out on the floor or to make sure my charge nurses got lunch. But even just taking over for an hour at the charge desk really helped remind me all of the things that happened on the unit. And I think that made my staff respect me a lot more, knowing that I was willing to get down there on my hands and knees and do the grunt work again. Take out the trash, clean up a patient, answer call lights, do all of those things. I never let that be beneath me when I transitioned to a leader. And I know that that really went a long way with my staff.
You just reminded me of probably my second favorite manager of all time, Betsy Johnson, in relation to you or I, oncology at Forsyth Medical Center. And I was a C.N.A. at that time, and she was the manager of the unit. Amazing leader. I am peeking my head out the door looking for some help to help turn and clean up a patient who was about to discharge to hospice. And she just gave me that smile that she had. She had just a winning smile. And she says, "You need something, Neil?" I was like, "Actually, I do. I need some help cleaning someone up." And she just threw off her lab coat, came in and cleaned her up. And you have to never be afraid to do what you're asking your staff to do.
Absolutely.
I think that's a very important part of leadership.
But it's not always easy. And that's one of the challenges of being a leader, is you do have different responsibilities and you do have to speak to different aspects of what's going on the floor. So it's really easy to get caught up in that. So that's definitely one of the challenges of transitioning from being a peer, being one of the team on the floor, to being in that leadership role, because you are held to a different standard. You're now responsible for the metrics of the unit. You're responsible for the patient satisfaction scores. You're responsible for ordering supplies. And I can't even remember all of the little tiny things that I did as a leader that took me away from my time at the bedside or on the floor with my staff.
Yes, that's definitely something I didn't get to exercise as much doing night shift. It was like I said, the metrics of it. I think for night shift, I focus a lot on those little things of knowing your numbers for the grid, of course, for staffing,
Staffing.
Those are always the important parts towards the night shift. During rounding, I found was actually a good time to help out, to let your staff know you're not too far removed. And
yes, when you're doing your patient rounds.
Yeah. So going in there, checking on your patients, and then kind of modeling what's supposed to happen. So I would influentially try to do the whole pain potty position thing if I went to go rounding. Someone might have had a complaint or needed to be seen about something. So when I was in there, kind of did like the whole handoff rounding that we always do, coming in and out of rounds. Do you need anything right now? Do you need something for pain? And then I would tell either their C.N.A. or the nurse, not as a like, "Hey, I had to do your job," as like, "Hey, I'm looking out for you. You still have somebody who's in your corner." It's really helping to empower them by the example of the opportunity to take the situation on so you could give them more time to be with patients themselves. It's like that voice we talked about last time. So they could say like, "Hey, this load, you saw that Mr. Jones is quite a cankerous kind of patient. So we have to kind of make sure we're not sticking a bunch of difficult patients on one nurse." And that's what I liked about rounding and connecting with my staff.
Right. Kind of giving them the snapshot that you got while you were in there and then letting them take it from there, letting them go and be the voice at the bedside.
I think an important part of that is when you then get that complaint, you can say, "Okay, I've dealt with Mr. Jones too. I know he can be very particular. So it's really not my nurse completely at fault. So I do need to listen to both sides of this story."
Yeah. Patient rounds will tell you all different kinds of stories, let you look at things from way different perspectives.
So as I was good about being for the nurse, I look at two things, though, I did struggle with was removing myself from the floor at times. My heart's on my sleeve and my heart's always going to be on the floor. Sometimes when I had to have those difficult decisions, even though I was close to those people because I had just been elbow in elbow with them to take care of patients, having been there, sometimes it's really hard to not have my heart on the front line. So that's something I know if I ever go back into a leader role, I would definitely have to work on not always being for the nurse, sometimes stepping back from that.
You have to. That was one of the things that I struggled with because I had worked on the floor for so many years. I knew every single member of my staff. And I left the floor for a little while and I came back in a leadership role. So I had relationships with a big chunk of the people on that unit. And we did go out for drinks. We went out for dinner. We did team building activities, like painting with a twist or bowling, just little things like that. We would do things like that all the time. And many of the staff remembered me from being in that role. But a lot of the newer staff did not know me as that person on the floor. And so I began to feel excluded. It was a hard transition to realize that some of these newer people, these younger people who did not know me before, are suddenly a little bit intimidated by me because I'm the manager on the floor. So they didn't have that prior relationship with me as a colleague or as a peer. They only known me as a manager. And so that was kind of a hard pill for me to swallow, to recognize that in order for the team to be cohesive, they had to connect with each other. And I had to be in a different role. I had to be the manager sometimes. I could not be
the nurse
going out. Yes, I couldn't be. Yeah, I couldn't be a part of that team, at least not in the same way. That was challenging and that was difficult for me. That was a difficult pill for me to swallow, but it worked out in the end because I worked to solidify my relationships with my staff. I just had to realize it couldn't be the same as it was before.
So I think part of it too is having been float pool for so long. We all are friendly, but we're not all on one unit all the time. So it kind of led to this tight knit group, but we still weren't so tight that it was impossible to kind of have some wiggle room for that.
That's true. Another thing that I struggled with was having to evaluate somebody's performance. That was a difficult thing to do, especially with people that I had grown up as a nurse with. It was a hard transition to make when you saw that somebody was not fulfilling their duties the way they should be fulfilled. They weren't following the rules or they weren't meeting expectations. So that took a lot of training for me to be able to have a conversation with somebody that wasn't meeting expectations. That's a really hard conversation to have.
You have some seasoned nurses who are 20, 30 years in, and here you are 10 years in. And you have a higher position. It's they kind of have that, what are you going to tell me kind of attitude sometimes? Or this is the way, the worst word you always hear as a leader is this is the way we've always done it. So those ones that don't want to grow. And so how to kind of change that mindset. And that's what I did like about some that I've worked with. Some of them you could come sideways laterally and be like, hey, we've done this before and we've gone through other changes. But yeah, that could definitely be a hard spot. Sometimes I fall back on my teacher training and do the infamous, we always used to call it the sandwich, something positive, something negative, and then something positive again.
That's a good way to look at it. I had to rely on my own mentors. I had to rely on leadership training, which taught me to look at the expectations, just go back to, what it says in the job description, what it says in the policy. We are all held to this particular standard, and these are the expectations that we're supposed to meet. And you meet them or you don't. That is a very objective point to make when you're having those conversations. But it's difficult to take the emotion out of it, especially when you're looking across the table at someone where you have met their families and their children, but they're just not progressing. They're not performing the way they should be performing. That's one of the challenges of transitioning up into that kind of position, is that you have to learn to look beyond that, to look beyond the person that you know and you love and look to the job that they're being paid to do.
One of my units I worked on previously as an assistant nurse manager, someone was having a pseudo seizure and they didn't jump into action as expected. And that was a very hard conversation to have. Whether you think they're having a real seizure or not, it doesn't matter. You treat it as something real. If your heart's in it, you know what to do. And when it's a person, like you said, who's older than you and you know their family or you know their situation, there's still the hard line of did you perform as you were supposed to perform? Did you do what a prevalent nurse would do in that situation?
Absolutely. Can you think of any other challenges that you had to deal with, Neil?
Luckily, I didn't have to attend too many for management meetings, for lack of a better term. But, if you were a manager, there's always the director of nursing meetings and the higher up ones where even as a manager, you're like big gulp and, oof, okay, let's see how this is going to happen. So with being night, sometimes whether it was a timing thing or it wasn't relevant to what goes on at night in a way, I didn't have as much experience, which I really wish I would have made more of a purpose to go and engage. So I'm not just that random name you see at the bottom of the pile of that unit. A lot of times, when you don't see that person or you're not interacting with them, there's just like, oh, I don't know who that is. I believe in connections in the medical field.
I attended many of those kinds of meetings. And the one thing that I always tried to do is try to be transparent with my staff. And I try to let them know, if I had a meeting and I was told something, let's say there's a change to practice coming or there's a new piece of equipment coming, I tried to make sure that they know this is the meeting that I attended. This is what I learned from our upper management. This is what we're expected to do. Let me know what your thoughts are. I try to get that information out to the staff before we had a staff meeting or before the rollout so that I could make sure that they could put in their 2 cents so they could let me know what their thoughts were about it. I tried to make sure that they were never blindsided with a random process change or something that came down for the whole hospital that they were not aware of. I had to be very organized in the way I kept things moving. I tried to make sure that I sent emails, that I had things that I posted on the unit. I tried to have it as much of an open door as I could.
As long as your staff knows you're in their corner and that you're going to speak up and you're not just going to say, oh, yes, I think that's a great idea just because it comes from above. Not every idea that comes from above is genuinely a good idea. There's usually a dollar and cents behind it. So
Exactly.
I think when you are transparent, like you said, and know that, hey, Laura's going to speak up for us. She's not just going to let them come in here and steamroll us with ideas because they think they're good. She's going to speak up for the team.
And that speaks to what we talked about in our last episode about making sure that your voice is heard, because I made sure that they knew that their voice was important to me. So if they felt strongly enough to bring something to me, I was going to make sure to do something with that information.
I'm sure you were an awesome leader for that. That's what I think of any leader, is the leader who knows the floor and is going to speak for their nurses, because it ends up affecting the patient more than we realize.
It does. That was one of the biggest transitioning from being a peer, being someone that's a part of the team, to being someone that's responsible for how the team performs. I grew a lot as a nurse during all of that leadership training, and I'm grateful to have had that opportunity, but it wasn't always easy.
Yeah.
When you mentioned staffing, that just gives me a pit in my stomach.
Cold chills.
As a leader, they're calling you. Especially if you have a good relationship with your staff. If they're having issues, they're going to call you. And sometimes they call you 24/7 sometimes. Another challenge with being a leader is to be sure that you set boundaries. You have to set boundaries with your staff. And that is not always easy to do. But you have to remember to take care of yourself. You have to remember that you've got a family and you've got your own personal responsibilities. Yeah. You cannot be tied to the floor 24/7.
Yeah, and that's where I did struggle. Like I said, being tied to the floor, or even just tied to the phone. Phone a friend isn't always a thing. Sometimes you guys got to figure it out, because if I'm not here for some reason, God forbid I'm sick or something, I want you to be able to figure it out.
Exactly. You've got to have
very important
plans.
Thing of grooming. I think the other challenge that was kind of interesting, thinking about it now and reflecting on it, is, so of course, like I said, it literally happened the week of COVID hitting. So all my leader training was virtual, which I will say, I'm 48 years young. I struggle with the virtual thing. That's just not my wheelbarrow of educational input. I need brick and mortar. I need a person in front of the classroom. I need personal interaction. So that was really hard to really kind of just click through a bunch of CBLs and listen to the little pre-recorded, this is what you do for this, and this is what you do for that. By no fault of the job, I think it would have been a lot better experience to actually had in-person training. They said like there used to be a big retreat, and it was a great time because you met all the other A&Ms from all the other places. So you really had good resources. It was a good kind of rub elbows and get to know more people, so you have more resources throughout the hospital.
Yeah. And you bring up a good point. Even if you do have virtual training, no matter how you get your training into this leadership role, it's important to try to create some of those relationships with other people that are in that same role, because that is where you get your new support system.
Exactly.
It's a difficult thing to try to maintain friendships in the same way that you did before. And like I said before, that I did struggle with that, but I had to just keep setting those boundaries. And if I was seeing somebody as a friend, I had to remember not to put them or myself into any situation where we might be disclosing things that we weren't supposed to talk about. It's the same thing, thinking about it like HIPAA. Yeah. You have to keep the conversations to their place. Yes, you have to keep them professional when you're at work, even when you're out, to dinner, if you're out as a friend, you're out, going to a concert or going to a movie, you can't talk about those kinds of things. You have to keep it personal.
Yeah, I always think of visualization, whether it's going in or out of work, of like literally crumbling up like a paper ball and putting it in the basket and leaving it there. Whether it's bringing nothing from home to work or vice versa from work to home. A lot of times it is easy to get a little juicy gossip of what might be happening in that person you've worked with forever. You're like, let me tell you what's about to happen.
Yeah. But again, we've talked about some challenges, but there's also some great things about being a leader. When the unit wins and you can plan those celebrations, that's a great feeling. And you make sure that they get the recognition for doing the work and you sit back and you watch it happen. The other thing that I love about being a leader is when people come to me after they've moved on and ask me for recommendations. I love writing recommendations. That's always made me feel good when somebody can come to me and say, I have this new passion. I want to get my master's degree, or I want to apply for this grant and I need a letter of recommendation. So I love hearing those stories.
Once again, good old Tracy King story. When I came under her, she's like, you need to work on getting med-surg certified. You need to work on this. You need to work on career ladder. You need to work on this. And as I went into my next unit as an assistant nurse manager, and they actually had staff as opposed to that Cartelli one where I had no staff, there was 2 or 3 residents that had came in. And I love that a lot of hospitals now have the residency for new nurses. And I told them already, start planning this. If you're going to go back for your BSN, you start this folder already, put your academics in there. You need to be usually a year of a nurse on a unit, get your med-surg certification and go forward. And I always like to pass that on. There's 1 or 2 old coworkers I'm still in touch with from the psych unit I was on that are working on doing that themselves. And so I tell them that opens up the doors when you have those little extra nuances to your resume that leaders want to see and say, hey, this person's a go-getter. I'm going to hire somebody that's going to be able to possibly inherit my unit one day.
Yeah, absolutely. I got to watch a lot of people grow in their careers. I have one specific story in mind. It was a woman that started as a PCT on my unit. She was a single mom and had 2 little girls and really wanted to be a nurse. And I remember writing her letter of recommendation for her to get into nursing school. When she graduated with her BSN, it's going to make me cry, but she asked me to pin her. That was a really, really good moment for me. And when I left the facility, this is just a couple of months ago, she was charging that unit. And I've never been more proud than to see the growth of that particular nurse. Those are the wonderful things that happen when you can get up into that leadership role, is you get to see some growth.
Actually, thinking of that, for a little while, I was tutoring at the community college I attended for Sci Tech. A young man came to me, his name's Tao, and he had a difficult first semester and really worked all throughout his nursing school academic career. And just the other day at work, we got to work together and it was just like, wow, dude, it's been a minute. And he's like, yeah, I'm traveling now and doing all this. And here you go from a kid who's struggling through school to someone who's able to go travel and do progressive care unit. And it's nice when you can inspire the next group of people.
Yes, absolutely. And be that cheerleader for them.
And I think that's what really drove me to come back to the bedside, is it's easy to have a title of leader, but then when you're at the bedside, you can be a leader by example and inspire people more as opposed to having to tell them. And they almost kind of come to you more when you're side by side with them. They say, hey, what got you to this point?
Yes, there's more than just that formal leadership position. There's a lot of informal ways that you can be a leader as well.
Yes, informal leadership. There's some amazing charge nurses I know in some of my old units that I feel like there was a great influence on being that informal leadership of just taking charge and being there for the patients. And that's the hard thing sometimes, is knowing that where your heart and passion is. Not that I ever minded being a leader, but when I really reflect back, like, where do I think I can make the most impact is by being on the floor and inspiring other nurses around me to be that person for their patients, as opposed to just being above them and saying, you need to be more in their rooms. And as opposed to being the nurse who is shaving the older guy or helping groom the old man before they discharge him to the nursing home because he hasn't been washed and scrubbed up like that for a while. So doing the actual work definitely helps.
By example, absolutely.
And that's kind of hard when you have the title of leader as opposed to the informal leader.
Yeah, that is true. If you are wondering, or if you're feeling like your manager is micromanaging you, or maybe you feel like they have got their focus on something other than how you are doing your job, just keep in mind that they are held to different expectations. They are responsible for the budget of the unit. So if they are constantly on you about why you didn't take your lunch, it is because they need everyone on the unit to take their full lunch. That feeds into their payroll. If they are talking to you about getting your HealthStream modules completed or your learning management system modules, it's because they're in a meeting every week that shows the percentages of staff that has completed that training. So they are being looked at for how you perform those little tiny tasks. So just remember, it's not that they don't care about how things are going for you on the floor. They just have to be responsible for so many other things.
You brought up something about time, and I remember learning a valuable lesson on the infamous incremental overtime. And those 5 or 10 minutes a day, 3 days of the week, over 30 days in a month, over a year is quite a lot of money you're stealing from the hospital.
Stealing from the hospital, exactly.
I struggled with, and I always would want a bedside nurse to understand, on the psych unit, we would have treatment team. And it was kind of like, this person came in here. These are the resources available for them outside. This is what we've done for them here. How can we link them to get outside? And a lot of times that was an important meeting to have, even though I wanted to be out there helping. So then it helps plan the rest of the day, how to empty the beds and how to fill the beds back again. Of course, those are the dirty terms for nurses, to empty and fill the beds.
Turnaround times, yes. They're looking at those metrics too.
And that's the most important metrics. I always said empty beds means empty pockets. And we don't like to hear that sometimes, because then it means you're going to get admission. So you're doing double the work. But those are the things that give the positions and the slots. So understand, if we're in a meeting, 98% of the time, we don't want to be in that meeting either. We want to be helping you, but it's kind of the necessary ugly of the job to have to be in that meeting.
Absolutely.
So if we're missing an action, it's not because we're hiding in our office, eating chocolates and surfing the web.
We're actually doing things for the floor. Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. But just to recap a few of the things that we talked about, transitioning from a peer to a leader, never forget what it was like to be there at the bedside and what it's like for those that are on the front lines.
Never remove your finger from the pulse of what nurses do.
Be willing to roll up your sleeves, pitch in, and help out with what you are asking your staff to do.
In tough moments, stay focused on the requirements and expectations of the job rather than the personal or emotional situation at hand.
Remember, be as transparent as you can, especially from sharing out all of the information from the meetings that you go, and be sure to gather your staff's thoughts on those topics.
As long as your staff knows you're in their corner and that their voice is heard, it will work out in the end.
And you have to set boundaries. Remember, you have to set boundaries. You have to have a life outside of work. Empower your staff to try to figure things out on their own. They know they can come to you if they need to.
And most importantly, help your staff succeed, and they will help you succeed as a leader.
We'll see you next time on MedSurg Moments. We look forward to connecting with you on the next episode of MedSurg Moments, the AMSN podcast. In the meantime, we want to hear from you. Send us your questions, topic ideas, and feedback via our official MedSurg Moments email address, amsnpod@amsn.org. That's amsnpod@amsn.org.
I'd also like to remind you to become a member of AMSN or renew your membership at www.amsn.org. You receive lots of cool benefits and perks, such as discounted pricing on the annual convention and continuing education.
We encourage you to help us spread the word and subscribe to the MedSurg Moments podcast via your smartphone podcast app to receive notifications of future episodes. Please be sure to leave us a review and recommend MedSurg Moments wherever you get your podcasts to help us reach even more listeners.
I invite you to join the conversation by sharing your ideas and questions on AMSN's Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter pages. And don't forget to add hashtag MedSurg Moments to your posts. Simply enter AMSN in the search field on any of these social media platforms to connect with us.
The content within the MedSurg Moments podcast represents the views, thoughts, and opinions of the co-hosts and may not necessarily reflect the views, thoughts, and opinions of the Academy of Medical Surgical Nurses. Until next time, I'm Laura.
And this is Neil. And as always, remember, MedSurg Moments is a moment in our lives, a moment in our MedSurg careers that make a huge difference.